Hey, happy Friday. Today we are talking about The Davenports by Crystal Marquis. This is a highly anticipated young adult historical romance that follows a prominent and wealthy Black family in Chicago in 1910 as their daughters and a couple of young women close to their daughters and within their circle are kind of coming into their own and finding love. This is based loosely on the family behind C.R. Patterson and Sons and maybe Harold Washington, but don't quote me on that yet. But we start the book with Olivia, the eldest daughter of the Davenport family, and we meet her in Marshall Fields, and she has a run-in with one of the younger saleswomen there that makes some assumptions about her based on the color of her skin before one of the more experienced saleswomen that know Olivia and her family step in. And so from the outset, we are both introduced to the glamour of Olivia being able to throw around some money at Marshall Fields, but also the realities of a lot of the assumptions made about her and a lot of what would have gone into building this wealth for her father, who escaped to Chicago and built up this incredible carriage company, which allows him and his family to live on this sprawling estate on the north side. And even Olivia is kind of protected from some of these realities and sacrifices to a certain extent at the outset of this book. Quick Marshall Fields tangent. Marshall Fields, the entire company, has been closed for years and years at this point, I believe. Now it's a Macy's and also potentially an interdimensional time loop of some sort, because gosh forbid I can ever navigate that place except to find the bathroom by the shoes, which is probably why I was going around 5 years ago when this happened. I was going into the Macy's and there were all of these people outside. I mean, it's State Street. There are people on the street at any given moment for a variety of reasons, but they were all dressed like old shop clerks, and they handed me, I want to say it was a button. It wasn't just a flyer. It was something that would have cost actual real dollars to produce. Not that paper is free by any means. They handed me this thing and they were like trying to bring back Marshall Fields. Now the placards are still there. There was of course lots of debate and uproar when that became a Macy's and what have you. But at the time that these people were demonstrating, Marshall Fields had been closed for a while. I want to say this was 5 years ago and Marshall Fields had been closed when this happened. I don't know, again, time loop. But I was just very bemused as to what their end goal was, and I did not engage in conversation, so I guess technically there was a way for me to have answered some of those questions, but it just seemed like a choice in terms of protesting on the street to bring back a closed department store, but maybe that's just me. So anyway, we meet Olivia at this department store when it was still open, and she is soon joined by her childhood friend Ruby. This novel has 4 protagonists, and we get chapters from each of their points of view. So we have Olivia, who we start with, Ruby, who is a friend of the family, and her father is also running as Chicago's first Black mayor, which is where I wonder if we are getting that Harold Washington connection. That is later in the historical record, past 1910, but Marquis already indicates, both within the plotting and in her author's note at the end, that she is moving up some historical events to kind of coincide. For instance, she kind of expedites some of the legislation and Jim Crow in relation to the Great Migration, or push back more generally against the Great Migration, although it also does still specifically reference the Springfield riots that happened, and I believe that is still historically accurate in terms of the timeline. So there is some potential and explicitly stated kind of timeline maneuvering, but I don't think anything is too egregious here, especially in terms of widening these worlds for these young women, because especially for Olivia and Ruby, our first 2 protagonists that we meet, they are very much feeling the pressure of the social season of finding a husband. Olivia has been on the market for a year, didn't find a husband last season, so she is introduced upon arriving home to this new young gentleman who has just arrived from England, and there is a kind of flirtation that develops there, and there is this idea that he would make her a good match. And then of course we have Ruby, her friend, who also comes from a very wealthy background, but her current circumstances are a little bit different than even Olivia knows. She is struggling a little bit more because her father's campaign has taken so much money and so many resources, and this campaign is incredibly important to her family, to their community, and to the people that her father is working for. But in this focus, Ruby has really gotten lost in the shuffle, and she is expected to kind of fall in line with what her parents are wanting for her and expecting of her, and this includes marrying Olivia's brother John, the eldest in the Davenport family. But John is pretty distracted, and he actually spends a lot of his time in the garage with his younger sister Helen, who has no interest in the marriage mart or the Chicago version of it. She would much rather be fixing Model Ts and digging into cars, because she and John believe that automobiles, which are starting to take over the roads of Chicago, are the future of her father's company, but they're having trouble getting him to agree. They've made this huge fortune in carriages, but they are starting to see carriages come off the road, and so they're looking forward to this change. And Helen is very distracted by this, does not anticipate falling in love, which is where we know we usually get into trouble, when we don't anticipate it, but that comes later. And John is also very much distracted by this. Even though he's had flirtations with Ruby in the past, there is this kind of unspoken expectation that they will get married. He has kind of deviated from that, and he actually has a crush on the maid, Amy Rose, who has a crush on him as well, but they haven't established any of this, and she grew up with them. She grew up close to Olivia and Helen, but they have become a lot more distant as they've gotten older, and Amy Rose, especially after the death of her mother, has pinned a lot of her hopes and dreams into establishing this salon for herself. Romance plotlines aside, because admittedly that is the focus of this book, but because this is a series, and I am going to spoil something slightly in that there is not a complete resolution in Amy Rose's salon plotline, which makes sense because that's her main driver, but there is a part of me that wonders if maybe we are going to turn her eventually into a Madam C.J. Walker type figure, so I definitely have my eye on her. And I admittedly have my eye on all of these young women, because I think that Marquis builds really engaging characters here, and I love that she doesn't pit them against each other either, especially as they are all kind of facing down these larger societal expectations from many different corners, as well as incredible change in both their personal lives and the kind of larger political and social landscape. And part of me is like, of course this takes place on the precipice of change. It's a young adult, it's also historical fiction, but I also had a moment when I was reading this book where I was like, oh, we're always kind of on the precipice of change. That makes sense, especially in seeing how quickly things have changed for even the generation before in this book, because the adults here have been through so much, and we know that they've been through so much, even if we are seeing things through the next generation's eyes. And I think that it adds these more tangible stakes for a very familiar plot line of, you know, the next generation kind of chafing against the expectations of the generation before, especially in terms of these kind of machinations of their love lives. But here, it is a lot more clear that for the elder generation, for their parents, there is a kind of security that they are vying for too. They have seen what comes before. They come from slavery, they come from poverty. So often in historical romances, even knowing the stakes of the marriage mart for so many women at the times that they take place, can be easy to kind of roll your eyes at the parents. But here the stakes of the parents' expectations, to a certain degree, and for certain couples more than others, really made sense at certain points for me. And there were times that I was on their side, because we are watching these young women come into the world and discover who they are in that world to varying degrees. For instance, Olivia gets kind of the most outside of the social circle because she ends up going and working at the community center on the south side, where she has been sent by her mother to take some donations, and meets a lawyer and activist. And so she gets pulled into this activism and this reform in a new way, even if I was a little sad that we didn't get to see the full breadth of that, especially because we were supposed to be rooting for her relationship with this lawyer, when it felt like to me that for a lot of it he was kind of negging her. And I get it, especially if you have this kind of privileged young woman coming into this space, this kind of you don't even know what you're walking into, makes sense. But because we didn't get to see that relationship kind of grow and develop, we didn't get to see fully Olivia interact with the other activists, get to know that community a little bit more, it just left me a little wanting in some ways. And I think part of that was unfortunately due to how the story was being told, because we were following all four young women, which I did really like, especially because it was all in third person and all of their stories do overlap. So I understand why we were focusing on them at the same time, more than going a traditional romance route and giving a different book for each character. I get it, especially for young adult. However, because we were dividing so much of our time between these different women, we didn't really get to spend enough time with any of them. So for the first half of the book, I was really enjoying myself, especially watching how the pieces were kind of set up, seeing what relationships relationships were set up, because admittedly I could see who was going to be paired with who pretty early on. And then somewhere in like the second half of the book, it both felt like we were just kind of spinning our wheels, and also that we had like skipped ahead 5 steps in some of these plot lines. Because we didn't really get enough time with any of these young women, especially the romances suffered, because it felt like we were supposed to kind of take it for granted that they were supposed to be with this guy, rather than kind of like watching the relationship more organically develop. And I didn't feel like I got to know the love interests really deeply enough. I think personally I was most intrigued by Ruby's romance because she was expected to marry John, and so she starts this flirtation with another guy basically to try and make him jealous, to regain his attention, because she noticed that when she was flirting with this other guy, he was kind of paying attention to her, both the other guy and John. And so she's kind of playing this game, trying to buy herself more time because her parents expect this engagement and she's facing down their disapproval as well. And so she is really facing off against those parental expectations and that perceived disapproval. And in getting to know this guy she's basically using to make John jealous, she falls for him. And so she's really battling against what is expected of her from her parents and what her heart desires. And of course there are larger historical and social realities that are playing out for all of these young women, and all of these young women are being faced with in different ways and kind of facing up against to different degrees. For instance, Olivia is kind of having to face her idea of activism and also how she can make change. I think that could have been pushed even further, honestly, because I don't know that it fully grappled with the kind of idealism that Olivia was being pulled into at first, because there just wasn't time, and then having to kind of face the reality combined with the reality of the good that she is capable of doing in her position. And then you have Helen, who really chafes against a lot of the traditional expectations of her world and young women in her world, and trying to find that balance between that expectation and her desires to work at her father's factory, and really struggling to find the in-between and the balance there. And what I think I liked most about this novel is, one, I liked all of these young women, but I especially liked that none of them were pitted against each other, but rather we saw all of them become more powerful, even if just personally through their relationships with each other. It would be so easy, and we've seen it before in this kind of novel, to end up pitting any of these young women against each other, especially Amy Rose and Ruby, who admittedly don't really interact, but they are in theory, at least at the beginning of the book, vying for the same guy or have feelings for the same guy. And it would be so easy to kind of fall into pitting them against each other. It would be just as easy to kind of play Helen and Olivia against each other, to kind of foster resentments between the two sisters. This idea that Olivia is kind of carrying a lot of the weight of the more traditional social expectations of the family, or Helen feeling like she doesn't measure up in whatever way and resenting the ease at which it seems Olivia can take on these roles. But it doesn't go that route. Rather, we see these young women recognizing and naming the strengths in the others, and we see them kind of conspiring with each other, but not in a way to forward their own wants and needs necessarily, but in a way to help these women that they love find happiness. So I almost would have loved to have more time to spend with these characters. I know we're going to get more time with them because we are going to be continuing in a series, but I think that we had to move so quickly to kind of move through these plot beats and end where we wanted all of these relationships to end, that we missed a lot of that more organic character development, a lot of that more organic deepening of these romantic relationships that really are supposed to be the heart of the thing here. At its heart, this really is a romance. So if you're going in for the historical part, it is there, but it is more kind of the backdrop to things, which does make sense within the context of a romance. This is kind of perfect for if you're looking for like the young adult version of Bridgerton, or if you're looking for something like the Lux series, or even American Royalty in terms of following different protagonists through different points of view. So it really is telling this story through a familiar structure for this type of young adult romance. It's been a second since I read the Lux series, but that was kind of in the same era and age as Gossip Girl, and we were definitely following lots of different plot lines, and here we are following lots of different plot lines. We just unfortunately were robbed of some of the depth of those plot lines because of it. Now, if I were to go back to some of these series that I read when I was a young adult, would I now think that they are lacking in some depth as well? Probably. So I definitely think that this is still going to sparkle for a lot of especially young adult readers because it is moving us to those plot points. And as a young adult reader, I was very focused on getting from point A to point B. But looking at it with an adult reader's eye, I'm seeing more of the potential for the nuance that I would have loved to dive into more because I loved all of these characters so much. And I would have liked to see them grow a little bit more organically. I think this also would have given us a lot more opportunities to explore the breadth of the world. I think we get pieces of it. I love the little details of things like the L rumbling overhead and just kind of tracking the visualization of how the streets are becoming more overrun with cars. We're seeing cars introduced. Makes sense knowing the history of the company at the heart of this as well. But it just had me wondering if there was another way to tell this story that still got to focus equally on all of these young women, still got to introduce us to all of them so we were really in it with all of them, but also kind of paced us out a little bit more. I think that this book was about upsetting the norm for these young women and forcing them to make choices for their own futures. But I think that that would have been a little bit more rewarding as a payoff if we had just been with them all a little longer. And I don't know the perfect answer for that because I think that if they'd all had their own separate books, it wouldn't make us as invested in all of them in the same way. I think that if we had kind of slowed this down and cut off earlier, we're obviously going to end in much different places for all of them. I can't imagine we wanted to drag out the length of the book itself much longer. So I recognize all of the kind of challenges of the storytelling as well. It unfortunately just didn't feel as deep, especially in the second half, as I was hoping for because I was having such a good time in the first half. But then there was a moment where I just kind of looked up and I was like, wait, what? Did I miss something? Especially with Olivia. It felt like we had just moved so quickly with her. I felt like I had missed a big part of her story and I didn't want to because I was really enjoying spending time with these young women. And ultimately at the end of the day, even though this was a romance, first and foremost, I think, I was rooting for these young women more than I was rooting for any couples. There's at least one couple, maybe more couples, where I don't know that the love interest really deserves their counterpart. But I will let you make that call on your own because I do think that these young women and this world are super fun and engaging, and I'm looking forward to seeing how they continue to develop and grow and whether these young men will deserve them down the line. And if nothing else, I'm definitely going to have to tune in to the next book or books to find out if Ruby's father is in fact our Harold Washington character, first Black mayor of Chicago, and I admittedly also want to find out if Amy Rose is going to build her empire. So if you read this, I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear what you think of our 4 protagonists and whether any of the young men deserve any of them. But thanks for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah, bye.